Hi everybody, thank you for joining us. Welcome to the Masters of Photography Q&A with Nick Danziger. If you haven't checked out the course, do check out the course. It's really an in-depth dive into photojournalism and photography. Photography, the word, has the two last letters are H and Y. So the H, in my opinion, stands for how for these, and the Y stands for why. And so what we're going to do here is ask Nick a few things about the how and why. I'm so very pleased to have Nick here to answer some of your questions on photojournalism and his work. So hi, Nick. Thank you so much for joining us. And how are you?
Absolutely great. And I want to thank all of those who are participating in this, because I'm quite knocked out by the numbers of you who are interested. I'm always surprised that people are interested, but it's a very welcome feeling.
I'm going to jump straight in, Nick. And I think what a lot of people have asked questions about, and it's really about being a photojournalist and some of the aspects of photojournalism. But to kick it off, Fedor has sent in a question, and he says, behind every photographer, there is a great human. Well, I completely concur. Nick Danziger is a great human. So his first question is a pretty big question, Nick. It's, why do you photograph?
I think, most photojournalists, and I mean, everything I'm going to say is personal opinion, but I think, most of those that I've come across, my colleagues, I would say, are great humanists. We feel for humanity. And I think this is one of the most important aspects of photojournalism is emotion, that you feel for what you photograph. You're passionate about the people, the issues, the environment in which we find ourselves. And I think that passion hopefully carries through in your work. It takes time to develop it. But I think certainly for me, more than anything, it's the storytelling aspect that is so important. And photography is a vehicle to tell those stories that I think need to be told.
I know that you're very passionate about all of the stories that you've followed, and could you just give everyone a little bit of a rundown as to some of the stories that you've created over the last few years, perhaps 10 years, just some of the things that have interested you?
Well, I've just returned from a big story on sickle cell disease. It's the most common non-communicable disease, and its effects on the people who have this disease are quite terrible. And it's often called by people in the medical profession the orphan disease, because most people don't care about it because it affects mainly people in the global south, particularly sub-Saharan Africa. Medication is often not available because there's no money to be made by the pharmaceutical industries. So I often come across stories and don't realize just the scale of what is taking place. So I think one of the things about the wonders of being able to do what I do is it's a journey of discovery. Sometimes I'm assigned projects, sometimes I propose the projects. That was a project that I actually proposed and was commissioned. But I can think of a whole range of topics, some that might surprise people. But I think if I look back on some of the topics that I've actually had the opportunity to access, would be behind the scenes with the All Blacks. Family were very relieved that I wasn't going into some kind of conflict zone. And again, I think what was so wonderful was to be able to spend time, five weeks in total. And I think with so many of you, we know that the success of what we do is the amount of time that we put in, partly because often sensitive subjects, when people give you the access, it takes time for people to trust you and to be able to open up and live their lives as they would normally without you interfering or without them being aware that you're there with a camera to record their daily lives. I mean, I would like things to happen as though I'm a fly on the wall. And equally, I would say some of the behind the scenes access that I've had with world leaders has also been absolutely fascinating. But I'd be rather, I would say, photographing on the ground in some difficult remote areas of the world, which often we don't see in the media, because I think it's important to represent the world that we live in today. We live on one, as it were, one house. There's one planet. And therefore, I think we should see each other as everyone is our brother or sister. It's one or the other. And I think that's really important for us to try and communicate that, basically under the skin, we're all the same. We all have the same aspirations.
That's great. Thank you, Nick. Aaron had a question, written in a question, and he asks about if there are any new habits or beliefs forming in photojournalism. Anything that's sort of coming to the fore at the moment that's changed over the last 10 or 15 years?
I think the business side of it has been what has changed the most radically. Everyone says, taking pictures today is much more democratic. Everyone has their smartphone, they can take images, they can upload, they can, in a sense, have their work seen. So obviously that's a dramatic change. And people go off in a way that they didn't before, with or without commissions, and have varying degrees of success with their works. I think that it has actually really taken place, that it is more democratic. And for many people, it's much more likely that your work is being seen. But I would say, as some of you will know, that I believe very much in using photography as a form of advocacy. So many of you are probably passionate about issues, but you need to have a public. You need people to listen, watch, see, hear what is going on. And that's more complicated and difficult to actually reach the people who can make a difference. Because I think so much of what we do isn't just about you taking a great photograph. It's then what happens subsequently. And indeed, even in taking the photograph, we rely on teamwork. I don't just arrive in a place and get the access that you eventually see from the image. That is often required time, commitment, research, and people helping me. I would say that what I produce is teamwork, just as in a team game, whether it's football, rugby, netball. We can think of all sorts of sports, and photography for me is very similar. There's a team out there, even if it's just you with your finger on the shutter at the end of the day.
Thank you, Nick. That's great. Really interesting. I've got a question from Joss. Thank you for writing in, Joss, and giving us that one. Joss asks, have subjects become more suspicious these days? Perhaps 10 or 15 years ago, before social media, I'm speaking from personal experience here, people were more relaxed about you getting your camera out and photographing them, especially in public. Would you say that even when you're entering some of the places and stories that you cover, that people are automatically more suspicious? I think that's the question that Joss is answering. It's
an excellent question. But again, if I have to refer to where I'm photographing, I'm traveling to a lot of places that aren't connected. They don't have access to the internet, let alone electricity. So social media means a lot of different things to different people, and photography as well. And I think that's really, really important. Yes, I think in the global north, in particularly Europe, North America, one of the aspects that I think has really changed and that worries people when I'm photographing, is it going to appear on social media? And a lot of people are very fearful of images suddenly appearing on someone's SM feed, and I can understand and share those concerns. But again, it really depends on where you're photographing, what's the situation, and your contact, your, as it were, relationship with the people that you're photographing. And I think always you need to be truthful to the people who are in the frame. Now, you may well know already that what happens to your work is anyone's guess. It might be published somewhere. It may never see the light of day in terms of a public, but we should inform people as best we can as what you are endeavoring to do with the photograph. What is its usage, its final usage? That hopefully will, as it were, in a sense, make people less fearful. Because I think I'm often working in very sensitive, difficult places, and I explain over and over again why I'm there, what I'm trying to do, and how the image may or may not be used and the consequences of that. But I can never fully guarantee how that image at the end of the day will be or will not be used.
Okay, Chris K.
How far would you go to bring some stories and pictures back from your trip? Which risks are you ready to take? Many thanks. Yes, well, you know, no picture is worth losing your life for. That's a reality. Too often I found myself in a situation where I said to myself, never again, I'm not doing this. But I've ended up over and over again in situations that I think I probably shouldn't have ended up in. But I think security is a prime issue about where you go, what you do, and how you protect yourself and prepare. I think that's really, really important. Some of you may be aware of HEAT courses, hostile environmental awareness training. It's something that I have undertaken, that I'm a passionate believer that depending on where you are photographing, that may not be the case, but it may be necessary for you to, unfortunately, because they're expensive, finance that type of training, just so that you have that awareness of what can happen to you in the types of environments that I often find myself.
Okay, thanks, Nick. If you'd like to put any more questions in the Q&A, please do. Or if you'd like to ask a question live, please raise your hand. That was a general talk about Nick and his work just then. I'd like to move on to something a little bit more specific that quite a few of you have asked questions about. It is something we cover in your masterclass with us, Nick, as well. But you obviously shoot in color and in black and white. So the question from Anders was, at what stage in a project do you decide to use black and white? And when you do use black and white, do you only use analog film, or do you often shoot in digital and convert to black and white? That was another question. Perhaps
excellent question. There's some simple answers to that. If you look at my work, color is either transparency, so that tends to be more, let's say, archival work. More recent work is all digital. But if you see my work in black and white, it has all been analog. It has all been shot on film, and I continue to use black and white film. And there's a way of working in black and white that focuses the mind in the way that it just doesn't happen in color. And it's one reason that sometimes I prefer working in black and white, because I call it being in the zone. You have to be totally focused. I shoot on manual, be it in digital or analog. And well, when do I decide? I think about the topic prior to shooting usually. I think, does it lend itself to color or black and white? And sometimes people will expect to see the work in black and white, and that might be a reason to shoot in color to provide the unexpected. So I think there's a variety of decisions that I make prior off. What is really difficult is shooting analog and digital at the same time, different camera bodies, very weighty, because I always shoot with at least two cameras, be it in digital or analog. So that means I have 4 camera bodies at a minimum. And usually because I'm traveling to some very remote locations, I will have an extra camera body to make sure that if something goes wrong, I can still shoot, because if one camera goes down, particularly the digital cameras, it's really complicated, as some of you will know, to repair a digital camera in the field. Black and white, I can shoot even without batteries. So there we have it. Those choices depend on the project. But I am sometimes asked to shoot both in color and black and white, and that really is complicated. I think you have to favor one or the other.
Thanks, Nick. That's great. Hopefully I'm back with you.
Yeah.
Sandro asks, I do a lot
I can see that. Yeah.
A lot of street photography and candid portraiture, but I find it very difficult, if not impossible, to deal with the consent forms.
It happened. I've taken pictures and I know they're going to be used, and I then explain, and then I pull out the consent form. It's awkward, it's difficult, but I use those consent forms when I think the shot is successful. And I can think of particular ones, even shot in London, where I don't necessarily need a consent form, but because I am commissioned to take these pictures, there's a good likelihood they're going to be published. And sometimes you just know that you've got a picture that's going to be used by the magazine or by the publication. And then, yeah, I'm always armed with consent forms. And I think for all of you out there, the laws do vary from country to country. I go to places where people would be frightened if I put a consent form in front of them, because they often come from societies where they haven't had the opportunity to go to school and therefore they can't read or write. So if you present a document which effectively is a legal document, that can also make them really suspicious of what you're up to. But nonetheless, I endeavor where possible to always have given their consent. So I hope that answers your question.
Very good. Thank you, Nick. Roy Wilson asks if you could possibly repeat the name of the difficult environment course.
Okay, so it's not, well, it is a course. It's not really a workshop. It's called Hostile Environment Awareness Training, HEAT. HEAT's easy to remember. They happen across the world now. There are several in the UK, but you can be trained in South Africa, in Kenya, in Thailand. They are very expensive. But I definitely, if you're not from a military background or from an NGO background, and sometimes you might be from an NGO background, an NGO shouldn't be sending you to the countries that I often travel to unless you have been on a HEAT course. Sometimes they're offered for reduced rates, and you can occasionally, there are NGOs that do provide them to journalists if you're a bona fide journalist.
Thank you, Nick. I think we'll move on because I've quite a few questions about your process. I hope my internet is not going to let me down. But Peter Dolan, what sort of lens do you use? 50mm or longer, a zoom? I know the answer to this, Nick.
I can answer that very quickly. Basically, I'm shooting on wide-angle lenses. So all of it's really 28 and 35. Occasionally, I go down to 21 on a fixed lens, so no zoom. I'm in there with the people at very close quarters. So if you talk about consent, most people may be aware of my presence. I hope that fades away. But that's all I carry with me on my camera bodies. I do, obviously, because I'm shooting commission work, I will have a 50 and an 85 with me, but it's rarely used. So I move rather than letting the lens move for me.
That's great, Nick. Thank you very much. Jeremy Scott and Thelina ask a bit more about your process, like from planning a story to how do you get on with fixers on location. Jeremy, you ask, how do you find fixers and where do you need to be in various countries? And also Thelina asks, how would you pick up a story and plan your story? Does it depend purely on your evaluation of what's important, or is it based more on emotional connection?
Well, to Jeremy, I see he's in Kazakhstan, so salam, merhaba, country I've worked in, had the opportunity. I mean, I often don't mention where I work because there are so many countries. It's really the topic, but to cut to the short is that I have an enormous address book through friends, through having worked in these countries. So if you say Kazakhstan, I have people in Kazakhstan that I would contact immediately if I'm going to do a story there. So really, we say in French, fil en aiguille. So it's like the needle and the thread. It helps me go from one person to the other. And obviously, I need people who are reliable, trustworthy, and understand what it is that I'm looking for. And it takes time to find the right people, but I also come from having made, maybe about 40 documentaries for television, for the BBC and Channel 4 and Discovery Channel. And I've worked with some excellent researchers. And that's what I talked about at the very beginning. It really is so much about teamwork that I'm able to do those stories that I do and access those stories because I'm helped by other people, and that team also includes great researchers. So it could be universities, it could be NGOs, it could be the UN. There are a whole variety of different institutions, bodies, friends, journalists who I would contact who have knowledge of the areas or the topics that I'm about to undertake.
Thank you, Nick. That's great. And if I could just ask, Shannon Martin has asked, how do you step back from stories and people who have really been impacted? And I've been on location with you filming your masterclass with us, and it is a very emotional process. And I think Shannon is asking, Could you talk a little bit about that, please?
Absolutely. Thank you, Shannon. I mean, I used to run workshops which were solely about photography techniques. Now my workshops include ethics, consent, and indeed trauma and self-care. Self-care is extremely important. You cannot produce great work unless you look after yourself. And it is true to say that I myself probably suffer from some PTSD because I see some really awkward situations. I feel for so much for the people that I photograph that I leave behind. And I think the difficulty is when you return home. In the field, you tend to just get on with it. So, I mean, unfortunately, we only have a short time here today, but really, it's really important that you take care of yourself and that you know how to take care of yourself. And certainly, I would really suggest to anyone who feels any form of trauma on returning from the field that you do seek professional help, in other words, counseling, because you carry this with you and it's not healthy either for yourself or your family and friends. So really, really important, Shannon, that you brought this up. I think it's an important part of the package now of someone who's doing documentary work in difficult locations.
Thank you, Nick. A question from Abdishukiri about would you have any advice? I think they're working in Somalia, which must be a very tough country. Any advice for them for working in Somalia?
Okay, Assalamu alaikum, Abdishukiri. Lovely to have you on board. And yes, well, I mean, again, I think how to look after yourself. I think you're living, if you are in Mogadishu or anywhere in Somalia, I think the dangers today, not necessarily from bullet wounds, but from being kidnapped, being used by a group that sees some value in taking you hostage. So I think that, again, what we have touched on is about researchers, the team that you work with. I'm often in the field, and I am often with military people as well that are there in a sense to protect me. But can I trust and rely on them also, given that salaries are often very low and a northern white Western foreigner represents a considerable sum of money if he's taken hostage? In your case, it might be slightly different. But again, you probably may have access to one of those heat courses. And again, as I really want to stress to everyone that no image is worth risking your life for. And I think I've evolved and changed as a photographer. I think something that's very important to me is that a man with a Kalashnikov in Mogadishu doesn't look so dissimilar from one in Herat or indeed maybe even in Colombia. And I think my passion and interest, and I hope that might be shared by many of you, is what happens to the civilian population. People with guns are usually pretty good about knowing how to protect themselves. Civilians, no. And so for me, the consequences of conflict, the consequences of extreme poverty fall on individuals, ordinary, when I don't mean ordinary because they're often extraordinary people who were often left behind. And it's those stories that I tend to focus on. And again, security is also upmost in my mind. So peripheral vision, I think even when we're shooting, we're always looking through the viewfinder, but I'm also looking around me all the time. And I work with people who are aware of security issues. So I might be in a very delicate place and I know that I have only a limited time to get the pictures that I need to get. So again, focus, research, team assistance is all part of the package of working in difficult areas. I'd just like to mention that Gilles mentioned, your colleague, Chris, that there is an app called Easy Release Pro, which you can have on your smartphone, which can absolutely be used for a consent form. And indeed today, you can, if you have a smartphone, just have someone record, say that they consent to those images being used.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Thank you very much indeed, Nick, for that. I'm just going to move on to perhaps your edit process. Somebody, Rodolfi Herino has asked, can you tell us a little bit about once you have all your images, your edit process, what are you looking for? I think we'd like to know what is the one that stands out, whereabouts is it, what resonates with you?
Sorry, you cut out a little bit on that. It's clearer though now.
Yeah, could you tell us a little bit about your edit process, Nick? When you've got all your images back at the end of a shoot, how do you go approach about refining it down to the 1, 2, 10?
Absolutely, really critical. And I believe in showing only a limited number of images. I think I'm looking to make sure that standard, that quality never drops. And so to put a weak image in, people start thinking, do you not have any other images? So I think the editing, we know that you can have great images. Poor editing produces a poor story. You can have not a great set of images, but with good editing, it might look pretty good. So editing is absolutely critical. And I do a pre-edit. In other words, I filter out all the images that I think are one way or another not relevant, not technically up to it, etc. And then I have a, as it were, first draft. And I look at those images in terms of a story. And probably a lot of you will also agree with, you might have a great image, but it doesn't fit the storyline. So it's really tough because I'm looking to tell stories more than looking for those individual images, because I'm usually commissioned to tell a story. It's usually a magazine piece, or it's for a book, or it's for a documentary project. It might be for a television series that are made from my black and white stills usually, rather than the color. So there's a whole variety of ways of editing, but it comes down to storytelling. And what I like to do, whether it's in black and white or in color, is to produce contact sheets. So black and white, it's very easy because the film is processed, and in the natural order of things, I will look at a contact sheet. And it also shows the way that I'm working. I think that's very important. If I'm shooting digital, then I will put those images into a contact sheet. So I will usually look at putting 20, 24, 25 images onto a page and look at what works and doesn't work. And as I filter it down, I then juxtapose those images. If it comes to an exhibition, then I might do what I call work prints, lay them out on the floor or on a table, and again, see what images work together. And as I started by saying, some of your best images may, unfortunately, not fit the storyline. I'm not saying you lose those images, but you have to put them in a separate file.
That's great. Thank you, Nick. Lydia Williams asks, hi, Nick, what's the best way to reflect authenticity in journalism? And I know it's such an important aspect
Absolutely.
In everyone's mind.
Well, you know, Chris, from our masterclass, that I will not allow anyone to crop my images. I'm a stickler about this. I believe that when that viewfinder is like a piece of paper or a canvas, and I don't want part of that canvas missing. I framed it so that everything in those four corners is relevant to my picture taking. And so I think what's really, really important is that you absolutely figure out from the very beginning what it is that you need to represent and how you frame those images from the moment. And then you have that authenticity. I'm looking for individuals in a context, and I don't ask people to change anything. No one is ever asked to pose. The only time, and there's always exceptions to the rules, I know if I'm being commissioned to produce a cover story for maybe Time or Newsweek or whatever, I might well need a cover picture. And in that instance, I need to make sure that I've got it in the bag, so to speak. So I make sure that I have one really strong headshot, because so often today, magazine covers are powerful individual portraits. And so at that point, I may well, because I haven't managed to achieve it naturally, I will ask someone to be in a certain position where the light is correct, where the pose is as natural as I can make it. But interestingly, I mean, for example, I've been commissioned by Vanity Fair because the subjects refused to go into a studio. So rather than employing Annie Leibovitz or photographers who have a massive kind of studio set up with assistants and lights, the subject will not agree to that. And so they need someone who can really work in milliseconds. And so it's having the knack of being able to capture what is necessary for the final product image, as it were. I don't like to say it as a product, but it helps when you're shooting and you know how the story is going to be used. I always ask people who are commissioning me, how do they envisage using the story? Will it be a cover story? Is it going to be an exhibition? Do they later on envisage a book? Because again, layouts are so important. We often, more than ever, see our images on screens, so the gutter isn't that important. But traditionally, when we were photographing, we had to remember that the middle of that image could have been cut because the page is divided in two if it's a double page spread, BPS in the language of editors.
Thanks, Nick. A couple more questions. Joss, you asked about, is it okay to ask a question about trauma? But if you could just put in the Q&A what that question is, because I'm not too sure what it is, and we'll try and get Nick to answer it. Rita is heading off. She wants to know, what advice would you give to someone who is planning to travel in terms of what to pack, since resources are limited? I imagine that's a photographic trip she's talking about.
Yeah, I imagine it's a photographic trip. I mean, you know, my basic premise is wherever I go in the world, unless it's a cold climate, everything comes with me on the plane. Nothing goes into the hold. So, you know, it's a small bag for my clothes, it's the camera bag, and then a backpack with my laptop and all the extras. So I think, you know, I could go through the detail one after the other, but I think one of the most important things, if you're going, I think you're going to Vietnam. Vietnam has a fairly reliable electrical grid. Extra batteries, always travel with extra batteries. I think that's extremely important. If you can afford a second camera body, then I think that's always worth having, because it's true to say that something can go wrong and then you're really stuck. And I noticed, I think it was maybe Jeremy who said, how many countries have I been to? I have worked probably, I'd never like to mention the number, because really it should be how many subject matters have I worked on, because I'm really more interested in the topic than the country. I mean, I love traveling. I love going to countries. I love languages. I'm self-taught in several languages, but what can I say? Yeah, probably, well over 100 countries, but it's the topics that really fascinate me. So yeah, Vietnam, Kazakhstan. I think most people think I've traveled everywhere, but there are still gray zones on that map that I haven't covered.
Thanks, Nick. I'm sure it won't be long before you get there. A question from Chaim Berman about the personal bias, or perhaps political bias, of the fixers and the people who are looking after you. I think this is particularly relevant in North Korea, correct?
Absolutely. So I think, you know, this comes back to the question that was asked. I'm sorry, I can't remember everyone's name because I'm trying to get through. There's so many questions. When you talk about authentic, I think one of the really important things is veracity. So let's add from, you know, authenticity, truthfulness. Let's also talk about veracity. So it's partly your job to make sure you have the right fixer, but equally you need to still check the veracity of the story. I have often been led by the nose, and it's my duty to make sure that I get as far as I can in terms of digging down deep into the story to make sure it really is the story that I'm undertaking. Difficult, really difficult when it's not your language, when it's a new country, but you get to understand people's reactions. And I think, you know, that's something about photography, because a lot of people say to me, what photography course should I go on? I think, you know, as a documentary photographer, you also need to be a psychologist, a detective, an anthropologist. There's so many different skills that you need to bring to your work so that the work is reliable, authentic, truthful, etc., and that you, above all, can get on and work with the people that you're going to be working with to produce those stories.
Thank you, Nick. Quite a few people have asked about mentorship and portfolio reviews, etc., etc. I mean, this is perhaps not the place to fix people up for those particular things, but do you have any advice as to where to find mentors or getting your portfolio reviewed?
Well, I'm up for it, as you know, Chris. A part of my
work as an
educator, and why I'm so engaged with Masters of Photography, because I think it's one of the best means of moving forward. I mentioned about photography schools, but I think in a week in a workshop with a professional photographer that you like, I think it's really important to find a photographer that you can see yourself in a sense. in that kind of slipstream. I mean, I mention often painters. I mean, I started as a painter. I'm influenced today by Caravaggio, Bellini, Mantegna, which some people think, well, why are you talking about paintings? But it's their use of light, it's their use of framing. So I think that's really, really important to have a mentor if you can find one. Difficult because us working photographers, we don't have a lot of spare time, or find a workshop. I mean, I run an annual workshop in Monaco, and it's only for 8 people. So you get one-to-one mentorship part of the time, and find someone that runs workshops that you can empathize with. And that, I think, will take you up to the next level. I've actually noticed in the chat that some of my former participants in my Monaco workshop are there. So hi, Tanya, I noticed you were there.
Well, that's great, Nick. And I know that the September Monaco workshop, you do have a few places left, and the details for that, live workshop in Monaco with Nick are on Nick's website. So, and my daughter's done that workshop, and she absolutely loved it. So that just goes to show how much veracity I put in Nick's workshops. Joss, yes, no, Joss has asked a question about the ethics of trauma, and photographers who are asking subjects to tell their stories and recount their trauma for the benefit of the story, but then sort of leaving them with no support. I think this is probably an ethical question, Nick, about trauma.
Yeah, I mean,
parachuting in, perhaps.
Yeah, Joss, and yeah, I mean, you're a clinical psychologist, and you've echoed my thoughts about the support for journalists. There's also the DART Center. So I work with professionals in the field who deal with journalists coming out of conflict zones and from traumatic experiences. So I think, ethics is a major part. As I said, some of my workshops are master's programs. For example, I do a module on ethics, and it's very complicated, and there are a lot of gray issues. So I can't give you a kind of black and white answer, but it is true to say that we often leave people behind with no support. Sometimes I've been very fortunate. One of my more recent projects in the Central African Republic, sorry, it's my language because I also, this project was in French. So it was République Centrafricaine and everything was in French. But I had the opportunity to work with a team, Denis Mukwege. I don't know if you've heard of Dr. Mukwege. He won the Nobel Peace Prize for the work that he's done with women who've been victims of sexual and gender-based violence. And so I had the opportunity to produce this work with psychologists and lawyers and doctors. And so therefore, I think that it was a template of how we should work, but it's not always available. So I think, indeed, today, that's why I say it's so important to have different skills, because just to enter, take pictures and leave is not the way that I wish to work. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but as much as possible, I like to explain, and I think it's something that you saw, Chris. I don't charge in there with the cameras out, shooting straight away. You might miss the most important image because you arrive at a candid moment where the person is relaxed and maybe in a difficult situation, but is very representative. But you need to really explain as best as you can what is your, as I've said already, what it is you're trying to achieve, what you expect from them, why you're doing this, what is the purpose. And hopefully in that way, you're doing, I would say, due diligence as best as possible. It's not necessarily going to help them. I think too many journalists, myself included, used to think it's therapeutic, cathartic for people to tell their stories. But I worked on a story where, not on my own, I was with 2 women, and we were all in floods of tears because the story was so deeply difficult and traumatic. And I think it replunged this poor young woman back into those events that had taken place previously. Would we have not? I don't think any of us would have done this story had we realized what was going to take place. I mean, I have subsequently re-met this woman, and she's learning and wants to become a social assistant to help other women and girls. But yeah, I think you have to tread very, very carefully. But a lot of the work I'm doing, I have, as I mentioned over and over again, I'm working not alone, I'm working as a team. In the Central African Republic, I had the wonderful, I would say, luxury of working alongside a psychologist who, in a sense, probably felt that the person, because we drew up a plan of what kind of stories and who we could approach, because he felt that they were in the capacity to be able to recount their story and have their photograph taken.
Thank you, Nick. Unfortunately, we are running to the end of our webinar, and if I could ask those questions that we haven't had a chance to answer here, if you simply email them to info@mastersof.photography, I'm sure, Nick, you wouldn't mind. We'll answer them and email you back with some answers. And it's been extraordinary, and I'm sorry if we didn't get around to answering all your questions. And I would like to thank Nick so very, very much for sharing this time and his incredible advice and story with us all. And thank you, Nick.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. I love responding. I'm sorry we haven't had the chance to respond to everyone. I hope we've done some justice in responding to most of the questions. But as Chris mentioned, don't hesitate to send in your questions. I hope at some point I get around to answering them. My schedule, as I mentioned, busy photojournalist, it's difficult to even do the mentorship, but it's something that I am equally passionate about. And I just want to answer one last question, because although I have already answered one of yours, Jeremy, I do work directly with writers, not always. And in that case, if I'm working with a writer, it's usually before I go on the story. But it happens. I've been working on US presidential campaigns where the writer's on the same plane with me and I don't even realize he's on the same plane. So different horses for different courses. Some writers like working with you. Some writers prefer working on their own. And the same applies to photographers. Some photographers don't want the writer around. I always think it's good to work as a team. And if someone's doing the text, it can be really, really helpful. There's so much to undertake, just producing strong images. Any support and help from any direction is going to be beneficial to you. So once again, Chris, thanks for giving me this opportunity. I've really enjoyed everything that we've worked together with on Masters of Photography. And so pleased that so many of your followers were able to join us today.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you all out there for joining us and making this our webinar. And thank you for those of you who've already bought Nick's course with us, and I hope you've enjoyed it. It is really a deep dive into all the things that we've discussed today. I feel like any one of those questions we could have spent half an hour answering any one of them, but unfortunately, time is limited. So I want to thank you all again. Thank you again, Nick, and speak to you all soon. Don't forget, email us at info@mastersof.photography if you have any other questions, and we'll try and get those answered. Thank you, everyone. Have a pleasant evening or wherever you are in the world, and talk to you again soon. Bye-bye.
I'm Nick Danziger, and welcome to my course.